Next is lateralisation or hemispheric lateralisation. So this is to do with the different hemispheres of the brain, and it's to do with split brain research. So lateralisation is the idea that the two hemispheres have specific functions, that one hemisphere may be more dominant in a certain function than another hemisphere. So this is due to a lot of evidence, in particular, on the language centres in the left hemisphere. So the diagram on the right there kind of suggests that certain hemispheres are better at tasks than the other hemisphere. In terms of lateralisation, it's worth knowing that your brain works as kind of two independent hemispheres, but then information is collated together. So something that's relevant for the study that we'll look at, information from your right visual field, so your right eye is processed by your left hemisphere, information from your left visual field is processed by your right hemisphere, and that information is shared through a bundle of nerve fibers in the middle called the corpus callosum. So your hemispheres work independently and then collate information in order to kind of function normally. So that's what happens in a normal brain. So the corpus callosum in red here is kind of a bunch of nerve fibers. It connects two hemispheres of the brain, and it allows our hemispheres to work together. So in a neurotypical brain, everyone will have a corpus callosum, and the two hemispheres will work alongside each other. There is a body of research referred to as split brain research. This is where patients have had their corpus callosum removed, and these patients have been studied to look at the differences between the functions of the hemispheres. So what psychologists have been able to do with split brain research is to look at how the two hemispheres of the brain work when they're functioning separately from another. So these are not neurotypical patients. They are patients that have had their corpus callosum severed. And this used to happen, as it used to be, one treatment for severe epilepsy. It's not done anymore, but it used to be a treatment for epilepsy. So there is a study by Sperry into split brain patients, and Sperry examined a set of split brain patients to look at what would happen if information was only passed to one hemisphere or the other. There are some videos on the PowerPoint of Joe, who's a split brain patient, and it's worth watching them to see what Joe can and cannot do. So Sperry's experiment was a quasi-experiment. These patients had already had the procedure to sever their corpus callosum. He took 11 patients and he wanted to examine the functions of the different hemispheres. So Sperry asked them to stare ahead at a fixation point. He then presented information to either one or both hemispheres for 1/10 of a second, and then he wanted to see how that information was processed. So Sperry showed that if a split brain patient is shown an image to their right visual field, they can say what that image is, because the right visual field is connected to the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere is your language hemisphere. However, if an image was shown to the left visual field, the patient would not be able to say what they had seen, because that is not a language hemisphere. However, if an image was shown to the left visual field and the patient was asked, have you seen anything? And they said, no, I have not. And they were asked to shut their eyes, pick up a pen with their left hand and draw what they had seen. They would draw the object that they had seen, but they would still not be able to name that object. Because that hand is controlled by the same hemisphere that saw the picture. So Sperry suggested there were three main findings. First of all, patients could verbalise an image that was shown to their right visual field. They cannot verbalise an image shown to their left visual field, but they can draw it with their left hand. And if they're shown an image in both their visual fields, they would say they've seen the one in the right, but they would draw the one they've seen in the left with their left hand. So if they looked straight ahead and they had an image of a key projected to their left visual field and a car projected to their right visual field. If you asked them what they had seen, they would say they'd seen a car. If you asked them to draw with their left hand what they had seen, their left hand would draw a key, and they wouldn't be able to verbalize why they had drawn a key because their verbal hemisphere had seen a car. They could also draw with their right hand what their right visual field had seen, because again, it's connected to the left hemisphere. Once you've watched the videos on Joe and been through kind of those three main results, again, this is a good table to work through to just test your understanding of what would happen in different scenarios. So down the left, you've got a series of different scenarios. You can then explain what would happen in split brain patients and explain why it would happen. So for example, the second one down, if an object is placed in the left hand and the patient is asked to name that object, the patient cannot do that because their left hand is connected to their right hemisphere. Their right hemisphere cannot talk, so they cannot name the object in their left hand. If they were asked to name an object in their right hand, they would be able to name it because that connects to the language hemisphere. So that is the idea of lateralisation, and that is a split brain research. You can obviously evaluate this research. There's an example of an evaluation point here talking about the limited sample size. Sperry only used 11 participants, so you've got an elaborated paragraph there which evaluates the sample size of the research, not the theory of the research. You can also evaluate more about the methodology. It was standardized and well designed. It was replicable, so it's all positive stuff. However, it lacks temporal validity because it's a very old operation, split brain research, and we cannot establish cause and effect. So there's no way to determine whether it was the epilepsy in the patients that caused the lateralisation, whether it was the damage in the operation that caused the lateralisation. So there is a lack of causation in Sperry studies. Lateralisation also seems to change over time in a normal brain. So you can use this as an AO3 point when you're evaluating the concept of lateralisation. We tend to lateralise more at different stages of our life. So lateralisation tends to increase when we're younger and decrease when we are older. So that can be used, so you can argue that the idea of lateralisation is reductionist. Also, language is not necessarily just in the left hemisphere. More modern research has suggested that language can move into the right hemisphere. However, you can counter that. The majority of the research suggests that language is in the left hemisphere. You can also evaluate kind of the concept of duality and kind of the differences between the two hemispheres. Bear in mind, with all of biopsychology, you can get research methods questions. Your textbook and Caboodle will give you examples of research methods, questions on all of biopsychology, and it's worth going through them as you find them. This is an example of a research methods set of questions based on lateralisation. So some lateralisation and some sign test. That's on the PowerPoint, if you're interested. That is a closed question. Fill in the gaps to check your understanding. This is a 16-mark exam question, so it's a STEM exam question based on lateralisation. So discuss how knowledge of lateralisation and language centres have helped our understanding of case studies such as Robert's. There's lots to write about in here. It's important to know that you need to describe and evaluate because it's discuss. You need to talk about lateralisation and language centres. So look at the information about Robert at the start of the question. Talk about lateralisation. So it's a side of his body that he can move, and talk about the language centres and make a judgment of how it can help our understanding of cases like Robert's. So you've got kind of 4 AO1, 4 AO2, and 8 AO3 on this ish. It's also worth looking at Kim Peek as an example of lateralisation. And there is a link from the PowerPoint if you wish to do so. This game, Mr. Split Brainy, is up on the Nobel Prize website. It is a really good way to test your knowledge of lateralisation and Sperry's experiments. So if you Google Mr. Split Brainy, you should be able to play the game with the jazzy 70s music in it.